Folks, good afternoon, and thank you very much for attending our Marschak Colloquium today. I'm Matt Kahn, and I'm delighted to briefly introduce Angela Hawken from Pepperdine University. We're delighted to have her here. I was a student of Gary Becker at the University of Chicago, and so crime and punishment is a topic near and dear to my heart. And we're very lucky to have Angela presenting today on less crime and punishment. I want to make two brief announcements and then invite Angela up. And so the Marschak Colloquium would like to thank a number of sponsors who have made this event possible. So I hope it was a good lunch, both intellectually and gastronomically, if that's a word. We'd like to thank the EVC and the Provost's Office, the Vice Chancellor for Interdisciplinary and Cross-Campus Affairs, the University Librarian, the Dean of Social Science, the Dean of Humanities, the Luskin Center for Innovation, you guys are supposed to be cheering, and the Department of Political Science. I think interdisciplinary talks are so important for bringing North Campus together. So thank you very much for attending, and we're delighted to have Angela Hawken here today. Thank you, Angela.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. I know Friday is a challenging time in most people's lives. To begin with, I'd just like to acknowledge my colleague from UCLA who is not here today, Mark Simon. Some of the work I'll be discussing today is because of his genius in some ways. He'd been writing about some of the issues I'll be presenting on today probably before I was born, and I'm quite old. So it's, he really is one of, it's true. He deserves a great deal of credit. I tend to be the one who runs around the country collecting the data, but Mark has been a phenomenal voice in terms of getting the message out and really transformed the practice in many states across the country. So the issue here is less crime and punishment. We've had, if you've seen any of the data on incarceration in the United States, you'll notice we had a massive increase in incarceration over the last few decades. And there's been a lot of concern about what to do about this. And for the first time in really decades, we seem to have relatively bipartisan support for doing something about this. Both liberals and conservatives seem to find less of a disconnect in this conversation now. Liberals like the idea generally of de-incarceration, and conservatives have come to, in fact, in many ways have been quite influential in the new movement towards de-incarceration, primarily initially because of budget concerns. It's extremely expensive to put people behind bars. But increasingly, surprisingly in some ways, because of evangelical Christians being in prisons. Prison ministries was really important to give a face to people behind bars. And they would go back to the megachurches and talk about the person they had met in custody. And so that was really, I think, important in sweeping up conservative movement in terms of thinking of this population, not just as statistics for people to be concerned about, but as human beings, and that their suffering should be taken into consideration also. So in many ways we now see, I think in recent history, the first time, a dialogue among both conservatives and liberals about how to address this problem. The problem is massive. We have 7 million people in the United States under the supervision of corrections authorities. That means they're either in prison or jail, or they're in the community under what we call community supervision. So they either have a probation officer or a parole officer that they must regularly report to, and they must subscribe to a set of rules. Well, so we have about 5 million on that status in our communities. The failure rates on probation and parole are really quite high. If you're a parolee, what that means is that you were released from a prison, from a state facility after serving a relatively long term. Your probability of returning to custody within 3 years is around 50%. So about half of them will go back. If you're a probationer, your probability of being returned to custody is about 30%. So it's very hard to think about how to address the custody problem without figuring out a way to solve the community corrections problem, because the flow through from community corrections into our prison system is so very high. And the challenge, I think, for many of us who've been interested in this problem is that so much has been done. You know, I'm going to talk to you in a very gloomy way soon about evidence-based practices. We've seen many evidence-based practices proliferating across the country, and their numbers still been pretty stable. So we keep trying to fix this, and we haven't made a whole lot of progress in terms of denting that return to prison. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the mess, and then I'm going to talk to you about some actual room for hope. We do seem to find now that there are some strategic ways of managing this sort of population that does both reduce incarceration and crime. Historically, that's always been thought of as a trade-off. You can have less incarceration, but that comes at a cost, and the cost is more crime in the community. That you couldn't have both simultaneously. And to my introducer over there, I'm sure Gary Becker is going to be very uncomfortable about all the research that I'll be presenting to you today. Because traditionally, economists often thought of that trade-off between punishment, certainty, and severity. We now have some very compelling evidence that Gary had it wrong. All right, so first of all, just to keep you gloomy over lunch, is entering really this notion of evidence-based practices. And for those of us who are academics, this sounds very reasonable. So an evidence-based practice is really something that is based on evidence. We have some literature that suggests this program works. And what we do now, typically, is require that practitioners go shopping from a list of evidence-based practices. And this isn't a trivial issue. In some states, the legislatures require it. You may not implement a program unless it is an evidence-based practice, which would be great if what we were talking about was medical science. Where we had a strong literature-based, randomized control trials, all governed by something really credible, and we knew what we were getting. We know if the pill has any efficacy or it doesn't. So it assumes there's a good quality evidence base. And in our case, you have to be really careful what you wish for. The bottom line in my strong South African accent is to tell you that our evidence base is super duper crappy. That's an official academic word in South Africa. So the issue is, what is the evidence for our evidence-based programming? And this is where it gets kind of really, so David Farabee, who's in the room here from UCLA, and Sheldon Jang from San Diego State, were really responsible for highlighting what I think is quite scandalous in many ways. This is NREP, the National Repository for Evidence-Based Programs and Practices. It's funded by and put in place by SAMHSA, and many organizations have to go to this list to choose their programming, offender-based programming. And the purpose of this was to help the mere mortals who had to provide programming and didn't have academic expertise by giving them a list to choose from that was scientifically tested and ready to be disseminated to those mere mortals. Well, it's SAMHSA, and it's a repository. The word repository in itself sounds very scientific. And it's evidence-based, so we should all now go home and not worry about accumulating any new evidence because we're done. And they can just keep selecting from this now tried and trusted, best vetted list of crap. All right, so here we have it. David Farabee and colleagues looked at this and they said, okay, let's take a look at this repository. Let's look at the programs that are targeting offenders. And let's see the relationship between the effect size. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with this literature, effect size tells you whether the program's working. The bigger the effect size, the bigger the difference between the group that gets the program and the group that doesn't. So what you really want is big effect sizes. But look at this. They decomposed the studies into really good studies. Here we're talking about trials, intent to treat, randomized control trials. And here are the really super duper crappy studies. Notice most of the studies are super crappy. And look at what happened to effect size. As the studies got more and more and more rigorous, we're not doing so well. Do we really want to make our legislatures require that the jurisdictions select from this list of ever so promising practices when they are subject to real scrutiny? We show that they do bupkis. Like only 14% of the programs in our repositories are even studied with any scientific validity whatsoever. Most of them are super duper bad. And if we study them well, we have very little reason for being optimistic, unfortunately. I told you I was going to ruin your lunch. It gets worse. Over half the programs in that repository were posted there by proprietors, people who would make money if you used their program. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that you probably get bigger effect sizes when the person's evaluating themselves. And there's strong evidence of that. So we had our repository with 48% of those programs, 58%, maybe 2/3, are from the people who made them, who stand to and there's the directions exactly as you expect. They all say nice things about themselves. So there's a really important cautionary tale. We hear the language of evidence-based practices, and every time I hear the word EBP now, I actually want to vomit. It makes me so mad, because we do not have a strong enough evidence base to even invoke the word evidence. We have no business curtailing innovation. Because essentially we said stop, we don't have to worry, we just use this list of stuff, it's fantastic. We haven't begun to scratch the surface. And I'll really impress upon this again at the end of this lecture, how terrible our current system is set up in terms of innovation, how hard it is to innovate in this field. And remember, we're talking billions and billions of dollars. In most states, corrections comes in just around the level of higher education spending. Big money. Very few great minds are devoting themselves to this issue. Millions of Americans caught up in this. Millions of victims caught up in this. And we are so complacent about the lack of progress in this field. Right, so 1/3 of our evidence-based practices have yet to be even replicated at any point in time. I have an example of a scandal. This is David Carabee. Here again, he and I were collaborators on this. We had a randomized controlled trial in New Mexico. And to protect the innocent, we won't even tell you what jurisdiction we were working in. And we found nothing. It was a nice program and it felt good. It felt really, really good. And the people who delivered the program really liked it. And this is one of the big problems that we find in our field. There's a massive difference between doing good and feeling good. And if only we could get people to realize those are not the same. Well, the program in New Mexico felt really good. And we spent a lot of time in custody observing them. And we thought, this is just beautiful. We love this. And I was rooting for this program more than anything. Running a trial was an intent-to-treat trial. We got the data in the end, rearrest rates in the community. How did they look? Nothing. It was like the flattest line you've ever seen in your life. Nothing, 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 nothing. The program did nothing. What was so fascinating was to see how quickly the people at that site were rallying to get their program onto MRAP, not just into the repository. They knew their program did nothing. But what had happened along the way is they had taken a customer satisfaction survey. And on the basis of this customer satisfaction survey, they were clamoring to be in the repository. That's how bad it is. That is how bad it is. I want more of you to be mad. Maybe it's the lunch.
What's a customer?
Customer satisfaction, so an inmate. The inmates liked it. So did I. Yeah. So did the people giving it. The only difference is you're just as likely to stab somebody when you're released. Alright, so the idea is that we really do need some standards. This is a field where the stakes are high. We need to develop some set of standards. When we talk about evidence, can we have some, at least basic minimum bar of what you have to climb above before we'll endorse that evidence as actually being evidence? We're seeing now, I think enough of us are presenting this aggressively across the country now that we hope that the repositories will eventually pay attention. But more of us are going to have to scream. It's disgusting that our practitioners have to choose from this list. They need to be served better by academic researchers than they are right now. All right, so less crime and less punishment. It is possible to have less of both, but it does require strategic thinking. And that, by the way, is not something the field has been historically very good at. We have our favorite programs, our pet causes. We don't do it. When I describe California, for example, I like to describe California as a state that thinks small and acts big when it comes to crime programming. Very little thinking, massive rollouts. We want to flip that around. We want everyone to think really, really hard and then try something at a very small scale. If it works, make it bigger. If it doesn't, kill it. It's very difficult to kill something that's big because somebody already has an ego invested. You've got to kill them when they're small, which means fundamentally changing how we go about business as usual. All right, so the big challenge, and this is such a delicious problem. I'm not a criminologist. I love this field. The problem is just so massive, and you can think about strategic behavior, and we have subjects who are so naughty that you don't have to wait 20 years to see what they're up to. Give them 3 months in the community and they're doing stupid things. So it's really interesting and easy to study this population, to see if your strategic interventions are making a difference. So someone who's interested in human behavior, or anybody who's interested in human behavior, I encourage you to come join us in this field. It's super fun, if not depressing. So the goal here really is like, what is the appropriate incentive structure to promote the desired behavior? What we really want to do is to allow people to stay in the community, keep them out of custody. I spend a lot of time in custody and tell you it's not a good place to reform people. Very few people come out of prison better than they were on the way in. So is there a way that we can incentivize behavior? Think like economists or behavioral economists or whatever we want to call ourselves as being, to really get the desired outcome. And the desired outcome is people back with their communities, safely in the community, not hurting other people, and not stealing from other people. Is there a way that we can bring that about? So I'm going to consider the case of probation and parole. What I'm going to discuss here really applies to many other areas too. Any situation where we have a high violation rate but limited sanctioning capacity. But for the session today, I'm going to be focusing on probation and parole. So this is how probation and parole works now in most jurisdictions across the country. I think there's a big disconnect in terms of how probation and parole actually works and how people think it works. Most of us assume there's somebody who's pretty serious who's just come out of prison. And by the way, all of us who work in the field can tell you, sometimes the prison guards close their gates quickly when they release them. That's how scared they are of the person they just released. And now the person's floating around in the community. But this is how most probation and parole departments work, is they have one of two ways to deal with an offender that they are responsible for supervising. The one, they really have one or two choices. If someone does something wrong, a misstep, a technical violation is what we call them. Let's say, for example, they test positive for methamphetamine or heroin, or they didn't show up. And so you really want these guys showing up to make contact. You want to know where they are, especially if they've got a geographic whereabouts where they may go and may not go. You want them checking in. Well, if they don't show up or they test positive for methamphetamine, there's really one of two approaches, for example. Either you can do what we call talk therapy. You can say, you really shouldn't be using that methamphetamine. Really, you shouldn't be using that methamphetamine. I'm getting tired of you using that methamphetamine. Can we agree that you won't continue to use that methamphetamine? And that really is what's available to that probation officer. And I've let me explain to you why. It's a little bit more serious than that, but they can't do anything. So what tends to happen is we get to the point of the action being too much. These little missteps tend to accumulate. So I tested hot for methamphetamine, nothing happened. Gee, I can use methamphetamine. Next week I test positive for methamphetamine and nothing happens because I don't want to be the probation officer that sends you to prison for 15 years, or 10 years, or 5 years because of a methamphetamine test. Because these are the two options. Either too little, I just talk to you, or too much, I revoke you. And if I revoke you, you go back to the sentencing judge and you get the underlying term, which often is years in prison. So you can see the trap we're in, right? Too little or too much. And the result is we see long lists of violations before any behavior is addressed. And of course, the preferred response is between these two extremes. If anybody here has house-trained a puppy or raised a child, you know if a child has done something wrong, you have to address that immediately so the child can learn to shape their behavior. If you let negative behavior get left unchecked until the 15th or 16th violation, and then just kick them out the door, most people would agree that was really bad parenting. Because somehow you said the first 15 boo-boos were okay, but number 16 is going to get you out the house. We'd never try to shape behavior like that in our own homes. Why do we try to do this with our criminal offenders? So what is the problem here? We tend to now have a situation where violating is rampant. If I start work in a new jurisdiction, on average they would show up and test positive about half the time. So, and that's for a federal test. So drug use is relatively rampant in a lot of jurisdictions that we work with. Punishment is scarce and inexpensive, so it's hard to monitor, it's hard to write everybody up, it's hard to punish them, especially as the system is set up now, they go away for a long time. And punishment is also very unpleasant for the recipient, both the recipient and their family. So the problem then is that the risk of being punished or the risk of being violated, given your boo-boo, is very low. And of course, people react to that. You know the punishment risk is really low, so there's little downside to violating, you may as well violate. And we see this increase in violations, and we get trapped in this high violating equilibrium, and this kind of Schelling's tipping model where you get to a point where it's just out of control. We just can't start to suppress the violating behavior now, we're swamping. It is possible, though, to tip this model back in the other direction. And I'll show you some examples of how we're managing to do that now. So a little bit of background. I'm going to talk specifically today about drug-involved offenders, and I really didn't need to. The program that I'm going to discuss now applies to all sorts of offenders. The only reason it's kind of fun to focus on drug-involved offenders is we have a nice, clean measure, drug use, that we can test regularly, nice, clean measure, so we can watch behavior change over time. But I can show you data that looks very, very similar for sex offenders, for fidelity, domestic violence offenders, any sort of offender, something very similar, very similar results are found. So we have probation departments and parole departments in some ways responsible for dealing with the drug problem in this country. About 75% of our offenders are drug involved, and they say between 75 and 80% of our drug users in this country at some point cycle through the criminal justice system. So you've got a large mass of the problem that's under your supervision at some point. So getting it right with our drug-using population could have many positive social returns. But the same thing, we monitor poorly, we detect it, we don't really do much about it, we get into that high violation trap, and when sanctions are delivered now, because it's number 16 or number 17, they're considered to be arbitrary and unfair. Right? I'm getting punished today because my PO didn't like me, or my judge doesn't like me, or I was really unlucky, rather than because I used methamphetamine. Right? So that really delayed response to the violation creates the feeling that I just got unlucky, rather than I did something, therefore there's a consequence. So I think one of the lessons in the program I'm going to describe to you now is just how important, and this is where I think Gary Becker and his friends didn't get it, is that the speed with which you respond fundamentally changes how we perceive that sanction. It's much more salient. I really feel that sanction quite differently if it's administered immediately. And if you can administer a punishment immediately and make it really relevant to me, A, you've taught me personal responsibility because my action led to the consequence, and B, you can give me a tiny dose of punishment to get my attention rather than having to bring down the big hammer, which is historically what we've always done.
What are GT and BE?
Oh, game theory and behavioral economic implications. Good call. That actually gets me to, I was told, and I forgot to make comments on the front end, rules of engagement. I'm very undisciplined. So I encourage you to be the same. If you would like to ask a question, please stop, interject, don't wait until the end, because by then you will have forgotten the question, and I will have forgotten what I was saying. So why don't we all just have a very relaxed atmosphere, and if you have a question to ask, please interject along the way.
Well, could I ask you to contrast the Joe Arpaio approach?
Let's get through this and we can talk about that then. Yeah.
We do want you to be able to finish the talk.
Yeah, that's a whole different.
And if we ask too many questions, punish us just a little bit.
Just punish me. Okay. I have my heavy hammer should I need it. All right, so let's talk about what we've done in trying to. We have recognized this problem, and a number of attempts have been made to try to suppress the violating behavior of the drug-involved population. Let's look a little bit at some of our history, and I'll go through this kind of quickly. The first is something that I was rather sympathetic to on the front end, and that was a move towards what's called drug treatment diversion. And that is, if someone's a non-violent drug offender, this is really, California is a big example of this. If you're a non-violent drug offender and you're arrested in California, what you have the option of, and it's voluntary, you can be sentenced under what we call Proposition 36 and be sent off to drug treatment rather than going to jail or prison. And on face value, I kind of like that. It seemed like, let's not deal with our drug issues in custody, let's deal with our drug issues more as a health concern and have them sent off to treatment. How drug treatment diversion tends to work, though, is that if you're arrested under this program in California, you're all mandated to drug treatment. You have to receive treatment. The problem is that not everybody arrested with a joint in their pocket or even having a hit of methamphetamine has a diagnosable substance abuse disorder. Not everybody who's ever used drugs is an addict. In fact, most people who've ever used drugs stop using perfectly fine on their own within a couple of years. The most common path to persistence is you just decide to stop using. But we pretend as though everybody who's ever been arrested is now a serious chronic dependent user, and they all have to go to treatment, which does a lot of damage to both groups in treatment. People who have serious problems do less well when people who shouldn't be there are there, and the people who shouldn't be there going into a facility with people who have real problems learn to generate a few new problems of their own. So this is a bad mix for everybody. Then our treatment decisions tend to be based on what we call self-report. Now, if any of you have ever interviewed any of my subjects, let me talk for a second about the validity of their self-reported behavior. Especially if you have a system that's incentivized to get certain responses. So if you're one of my subjects, for example, and you're being assessed for treatment, and you think you're headed to jail, and I say, have you used a lot of drugs? And you think, well, if I say yes, she's going to put me in treatment rather than jail. I'm going to tell you yes, 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 yes. Me, big. I actually surveyed my subjects and I asked them, how many of you have exaggerated your drug use to get to treatment rather than jail? Over half of them said yes, of course I lied. Wouldn't you? And then the same thing is true the other way. If you think that you're going to get a referral to residential treatment or something really intense, you often say, well, my drug use isn't that bad. So you underreport, and I ask them the same question. How many times have you underreported your drug use to get into a lesser form of care? And it's like, all the hands go up, sure. Wouldn't you? The other big failing, I think, of treatment diversion, not just that they allocate resources relatively badly, is that there's very limited use of sanctions. And this is how it works in California. If you're sentenced by the court to drug treatment, and you just go, well, not much happens to you. So guess what happens? A lot of people don't show up, and then if they do show up, they just don't finish, because the consequences are minimal. The modal response to not doing what the judge told you what to do is nothing. Really? Very little sanctioning capacity, and it's very hard to keep attention of my sorts of subjects under that sort of situation. So California is the big example I just mentioned. Only 25% of them finish the court-mandated treatment. Bad enforcement, poorly matched treatment. Everybody has to get treatment, right? Everybody has to get treatment. The people with real problems get a little bit of treatment, and the people with no problems get a little bit of treatment. No resource allocation. An economist did not design the system. Or anybody who was thinking. Now, the result was poor compliance and an increase in arrest, which is kind of embarrassing because it was implemented as the Substance Abuse and Crime Prevention Act. Prevention Act? All right, let me skip through this because I want to make sure we have enough time. Drug courts is another approach we handle, and some of you might have heard of drug courts, and this is, and because we have some stars, a lot of our stars get into trouble, and some of their kids end up in drug courts, so we get a lot of attention paid to drug courts. Much more successful movement. There's about 2,500 of these courts across the country, and the outcomes vary depending on how seriously they take their jobs, but in general, much more room for optimism than the previous sort of program I just described to you. The problem is that we have a massive, I showed you 5 million people on community supervision, about 75% of them are drug involved. You can do the numbers in there, we're talking about millions and millions of people who have to be dealt with. We have drug courts now that, we have 2,500 drug courts. The average drug court supervises 75 people. Massively expensive. Can't solve the problem with drug courts. Doesn't go to scale. And the reason is because of the role of the judge. If you're in a drug court, you have to come and see the judge regularly. It takes up lots of court time. And the role of treatment. Everybody's treated. So again, it's an expensive model. Everybody's being treated. Everyone has to see the judge regularly, whether they're doing perfectly well or whether they're doing terribly. They all get managed the same. No triaging, no adjusting our responses depending on their own behavior. And in many jurisdictions, the wrong clients are being served. And this is true for the majority of drug courts. Prosecutors get to decide whether you can come and play or not. And if you have any interesting history, for example, almost none of my subjects would ever be eligible for a drug court. If you've done anything in the past that makes them nervous, they exclude you from eligibility. So we have our very expensive program that has wonderful services to provide being allocated to the smallest fish in the system. Only if you have a history that's not much going on will the prosecutors even... Do you see how irrational it is? Let's take all our resources and target on the people who probably need it the least. Wow, we were the thinkers when we decided how to set up these systems. All right, so here's a new, more strategic approach. I like to call this behavioral triage. Don't tell me your drug use issues. I'm just going to watch you. I'm going to watch your behavior. And on the basis of your behavior, I'm going to allocate supervision resources and drug resources. If you can't stop using, you have an issue. Let's put you in treatment. If you can stop using, why am I going to spend the money on you? And I want to show you how big the group is that can simply stop using on their own, even with long histories of drug use. Most, and I use the word most, I'll show you the numbers, most long history of drug use offenders can desist from drug use on their own. why would we not spend that pocket of money on the people who are desperately in need of serious wraparound services and need all the help you can provide? So I call this behavioral triage, and the idea here is that not everybody is mandated to treatment because not everybody who's been arrested on a drug crime needs it. The monitoring and treatment decisions are based on observed behaviors. I watch you. Let's see what you do. It's easy to watch people in their drug use because there's a test cup. They're testing positive or they're not. There's an observable event and we can respond appropriately. So what we do is we now allocate our resources very differently. We direct the resources to those who need it most and take away the resource from those who simply don't need it. We're actually putting them into a treatment program can probably do more harm than good. It's not a victimless crime, putting people into a program who don't belong there. Right, so here's an example of behavioral triage and an example of just reducing that violating behavior in general. This program was started in Hawaii by a judge called Stephen Arm, and he was really frustrated in his first few weeks on the bench. He kept seeing cases brought into court to revoke someone from probation. And the underlying terms in Hawaii were nasty. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. So you could see the probation officers never wanted to send them. They let them accumulate lots of strikes before they sent them to court. And they kept saying, why am I seeing this guy in the 60s, in Hawaii they like to use methamphetamine. Why am I seeing 16 positives of methamphetamine? Where was I for number 2, number 3, number 4? Why am I seeing him now? And the probation officer said, well, I don't want to revoke the guy for 2 positive tests and send him away for a really long time. So he completely reconfigured the system and said, okay, well, how about this, probation officers? I won't revoke them. What I'll do is I'll give them a tiny sanction to get their attention. Will you bring them to me then? I'm not sending them to prison. I'm going to sanction them in a tiny, tiny dose. But I want to see them every time. So I want to inject some certainty into the system. So under this program, and this is the program that's now spread across the country, you'll see in a bit. It started off in 2004 in Hawaii, and it's now not everywhere, but it's rapidly getting there. Probation conditions are easy to read. They're reduced. If you look at probation and parole conditions in general, you really do need a legal degree to understand what you're being told the rules are. It's very difficult to follow the rules if you don't know what the rules are. So the first thing is everything's reduced to, like 6th grade reading, short lists that everybody can understand. This whole setup is really about rules of engagement. Everybody needs to know what the rules are and that they are there then to comply with them. So the rules are very clearly elaborated during the warning hearing. It's done in open court. The judge says, everybody in this room wants you to succeed. And this is how we're going to get you there. Here are the rules, very short. If you violate, we're going to monitor you closely. Every time you violate, there's going to be a consequence. I'm not revoking you from probation or parole, but I'm going to give you a sanction. And it's going to happen today, not 6 weeks from now or 40 days from now, which is typical in most jurisdictions. If you have a violation and it goes before a judge, it takes about a month and a half, if you're in New York, 45 days, for anybody to take action. Can you see how you can't change behavior on those timelines? Because if you sanction me 45 days later, and I've been doing well in the interim, it's like, why are you sanctioning me? I've been doing well. I've been clean for 45 days, I got my life together, my girlfriend even likes me again, and now I'm going to jail? There's no procedural fairness in that. Now they feel like they're going to jail because the system is broken. The judges are dead. Not because of their own behavior. All right? Tying the consequence to the behavior has to be quick for it to resonate. It has to be quick for there to be behavioral change. So the idea under this is that every violation has a sanction, but the sanction is modest. In Hawaii, it's a couple of days in jail. Increasingly, as we move across the country now, we're even looking in the direction of non-incarcerating. Some sanction that kicks in immediately doesn't have to even be a night in jail. And no one is mandated to treatment. They can always ask for treatment and it is provided. Turns out very few people opt into drug treatment. They always get it if they ask for it. If they have 3 or more violations in a relatively short period of time, they are mandated to drug treatment, and that continues to be monitored by the court, and there's no option. You can't flunk out of treatment. If you flunk out of treatment, you go to jail. That makes you a very compliant person in treatment. Makes the treatment providers love this because people come ready to participate. So what happens when the criminal justice system is transformed in this way and becomes credible? Well, we put this to a test first in the randomized controlled trial in Hawaii, then we did it in Washington State, and now it's really, we have trials running, or there are now trials in multiple states along the mainland across the country, funded by the Department of Justice. But initially, this was the original trial, Hawken, Hawaii, and hundreds of criminal justice agents really were involved in this. Treatment providers were brought on board, law enforcement was brought on board, so we had to reconfigure the entire system to respond super quickly. Not 6 weeks to get to court, go to court that day. That took a great deal of reconfiguring. Well, what did we find? We found that a system that credibly lists the rules and incredibly follows through on those rules and does it in a proportionate and small ways wins in a big way. Drug use plummeted. In fact, the drug use plummeted so much that this is still uncomfortable for NIH. I'll show you the results in a bit. And that same drug use result is true in Hawaii, it's true in Washington, it's true in Seattle, it's true in Massachusetts. Time and time again, we're replicating, we see the same thing. Most people can stop using drugs and put under the appropriate set of incentives. And those few percent that can't, now you tackle them with all the resources that they need to address their problem. So drug use fell, missed appointments fell, arrests fell, and then what was really important, I think, and this is probably why the program is spreading at the rate it is that the program was not especially expensive to start, and we saw a dramatic reduction in incarceration. So both behavior under control, they weren't committing more crime, and they were much less likely to be incarcerated. So this was the Hope trial. It was an intent to treat randomized control trial. They were mostly methamphetamine users. We see similar types of we study across the country now. The drug pattern doesn't turn out to be especially significant. We like to pick really the high-end clients here. These are people, by high-end I mean the most problematic, the high-risk, really, and those who are really at risk of going to prison. So if you're one of your next-door neighbors who was arrested with pot in his pocket, he's not making it into my state. These are really high-risk offenders at high risk of reoffending, intent to treat. So we started with 507 of them. Some of them were deemed ineligible, even though we did the screening well on the front end. We had a 2/3, 1/3 mix because we wanted to know more about these folks. We looked into some demographic details, and most of them showed up for their warning hearing. About 7% of them did not. These are characters who sometimes had been on warrant status, didn't even know about the program. We had 2 murders within a few weeks of launching the study. Both of them were this group. Both of those murderers had never heard of the program. Again, we're talking about high-risk subjects. They kill themselves, they kill others. When I say the stakes are high in our research, we really mean it. This is a description of our subjects. There was a nice balance across groups. The average age was mid-30s. We had a good balance in terms of race, ethnicity, prior arrests. See that this is the group that's been around the block. 17 priors. This was not their first rodeo. Right, and here are our randomized control trial outcomes. In terms of no-show for probation appointments, the control group subjects didn't show up 23% of the time. The hope subjects, 9% of the time. Positive urines. Control group was testing positive. They had 1 month notice of their drug test, and half of them were testing positive. They had 1 month to stay clean for that one appointment. Not so much. These guys were tested randomly, 6 times a month. Notice the big difference. They didn't have a month to clean up. Revocation rates, well, they were half as likely to be revoked, and this is the big difference here. Is what we had a lot of the average subject in the hope group was sentenced to 138 days. The average subject in the control group, 267 days, a sizable reduction in overall
incarceration. Could you just tell us what the numbers were in the study again?
It was 507.
I'm sorry?
The sample sizes?
A couple thousand?
507. This was the initial trial. 507.
507. I misheard you each time.
Yeah, 507. This has been replicated, so this is just the initial trial, right? We can send you details of the trials that have happened since. So this is now one of the better studied criminal justice.
Incarceration days over what period of time?
This is days sentenced. So this is a 1-year follow-up period, and this is how many days they were sentenced to. So in a lot of this case, these are being bumped up by prison. These revocations are driving a lot of this prison days here. Turned out it was about jail neutral, saved about 2 days per person on average for jail, but the big savings was in terms of prison. They weren't being revoked and sent back to the underlying.
Does the incarceration days include those 1 day and 2 days
yes.
jail?
Yeah. So what happens is, and why, so I just mentioned to your colleague over here, that jail tended to be neutral. The big saving was in prison. So the hope subjects are going for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days at a time when they violate. Control group were being sent to jail less often, but for much longer. So you can do a lot of churn for 1, 2, 3 days for every 6-week sentence over here. So the nature of the jail stays were quite different. And that turns out to be not trivial, because jails have to, there's a front-end cost to that churn, right? You have to process somebody through. So in terms of the cost implications, it was a relatively real issue. But this is what I think is fascinating, and this is what's really uncomfortable for many researchers. This is the distribution of positive drug tests. To be selected into the program, they had to have had a history of drug involvement, and they had to have very recently tested positive for methamphetamine, or one of the illicit drugs. So these are not kind of drug involved, they were really drug involved. Over half of them, once subjected to a system of credible rules, never tested positive again in a 1-year period. Now, they were tested 6 times a month for the first few months, and then it tapered off. Never tested positive again. And this is why we call the triage. Notice, the 3+ is where they start to get sent off to drug treatment. Why would we send this person to drug treatment? Which is what they would have had to have done if they were in California. We'd be treating them. This group took 1 bite of the apple. Why would we be sending them to drug treatment? Notice how much more effectively we can use our drug treatment resources if we can target the appropriate population. This is the group who, even when faced with the real credible risk of detection and a sanction, could not stop using. This is the group that is absolutely appropriate for Cadillac version treatment. All the wraparound services you can
Could you
provide.
tell us for how long a time they had to stop using for this to come out?
This is the 1-year follow-up result.
1 whole year.
1 year.
And you have, with the testing you have, that's your proof.
We had drug test results, yeah.
The drug testing is the proof.
Yes, this is actual test. This is test cups. This is not self-report. This is actual. We have a test and a result, either from a lab or from an active test cup at the facility. Now, what's interesting about this is how think of this as the bad behavior desistance curve. Right? This is a negative behavior we want to stop. We took this across the country. The next step was Seattle, Washington. The curve looked almost identical. The demonstration field experiment is now across the country. The curve looks nearly identical. The RAND Corporation has a study now for alcohol users, felony DUI offenders, looking at their alcohol systems subject to swift and certain sanction and testing too. I can overlay RAND's curve with my curve, they look almost identical. This is the drug desistance curve when subjected to a set of incentives that gets people's attention. And the consistency of this across time, across space, across drug, across everything, across researchers, across organizations has been rather stunning. And what is interesting about this, and I think this is where people get uncomfortable with this result, is what does this say about our model of addiction being a brain disease when half of our offenders can stop using? And I think what it says to us is that we use the label brain disease too liberally. That this group here really does have the disease model is relevant for them. But this group here just like to use and can stop when appropriately motivated. Yes, ma'am.
Is this similar to the drug desistance curve that you see with drug or wellness courts? Because you're contrasting what you're doing with drug or wellness courts, and I don't see that dramatic a difference, other than your claim that the drug courts are giving extensive treatment to everyone, and that's not my experience seeing the drug courts.
Right. Well, the drug courts are very different. There's no drug court. There's 2,500 of them, and they're really different from drug court to drug court. So depending on which court you have or courts you have experience with, they really look quite different. The difference between HOPE, I like the drug court model. And what I liked about HOPE is that it shared many of the characteristics of the drug court model. What I liked about HOPE is that they would let subjects in that drug courts wouldn't, in most jurisdictions.
I see. So it's a different population.
Different population, but this is the other difference, is that I was looking for a massive solution. 75 a time is not a massive solution. I wanted courts to be able to go to scale. So the typical drug court can see 75 clients. This model, because they only come in, and that's one of the difference, they only see the judge when they violate. They don't come in for status hearings. The judge in Hawaii is supervising 2,000. When you can do 2,000 at a time, rather than 75 at a time, you have a solution that can start to address the problems of the masses, rather than only that lucky group who happens to get in because the DAs let them in. So we really are looking for a solution for really troubled people that no one else wants to deal with. And that's the difference.
The biggest differences are the population and then the frequency of the judges' involvement.
Right.
So drug courts, you're saying, are using judges more than they need to.
Exactly. What we should do is focus the judge's attention on those who can't behave. And that's what this does. It just reconfigures, it's a resource allocation issue. Focusing the resources on people who can't stop drug use, who will keep violating, and make sure the judges spend more time with those people. If someone's behaving perfectly well, why am I even going to inconvenience them, making them come to court?
But the desistance curve
So
is
very,
similar?
very similar. One of the reasons I felt enthusiastic about this model, and it's not a perfect model, I'll talk about issues in a bit. One of the reasons I was enthusiastic about this was I like to be in custody, I like to speak to my offenders and to hear what's going on. We felt quite heartened when we did jail interviews. What we were hoping would resonate with subjects was the idea of procedural fairness. The sanctions were very proportionate to what had happened. Small doses of sanction that escalated if you continued to make missteps. What we found across the board was relatively positive reviews of the program, whether they were in drug treatment, whether they were in jail. This was the most surprising. Even if they were serving a sentence for a hook violation, they still had positive things to say about the program. And this is the language we were hearing from them. Well, the judge said I'd go to jail if I used, and I didn't. I'm here now. Next time I will try to do better. So we're hearing the kind of language of personal responsibility that we really hadn't heard in much of the other studies we've been involved with, and we thought that was a rather good, positive outcome. In general observations, and I'm going to talk to you about well-intended researchers going bad, and I'm that person. The key to a program like this is to start small. It's a program on credible threats. If anybody who's ever done any game theory, if you can't deliver on the credible threat, it's broken. I mean, you just don't have a model that's going to bring about the behavior change anymore. If you have a lot of people in the program at the same time, much of the violating is front-ended. So if everybody's violating at the same time, you've got that problem of high violation, you can't respond to all those violations, and you can't follow through on the thread, and your model's destroyed, and you might as well not have started it. Starting small, getting the first group's violating behavior under control, and then expanding is the natural way to do this. Keep this in mind a few slides from now when I talk about Washington State. That went crazy. The hope effect that we found here held across probation office, held across judges. It turned out that judges who didn't even like the program, in fact, were really resentful of being told how to do this, but for the trial they agreed to do it, had the same results. So whether the judge was enthusiastic, as long as the judge followed through and played by the rules, we got the same outcome.
It's person neutral.
Person neutral, not an operator effect. That was really important. And I think one of the big issues here was that leniency wasn't kindness, it was really consistency. And giving people a chance to shape their behavior, giving them a chance to learn from their mistakes with small doses of punishment rather than putting them away because you were just tired of dealing with them. But Hawaii is a Hawaii, right? Oh, it was so funny. When we first had our results after the trial, everyone said, but it's Hawaii. Everyone's nice in Hawaii. And I said, well, my control group were Hawaiian too, and they were doing terrible things. It's like, but it's Hawaii. So it was the worst. Everybody thinks you're so lucky to have had this trial. I've been working in Hawaii now for nearly 10 years. So lucky to have had this trial in Hawaii. It must be wonderful. It's terrible. I have to fly 6 hours to get there, to go to jail, to go to court, to fly back, managing staff across the country. There's nothing fun about a Hawaii trail. Jail is jail, whether it's Hawaii or Los Angeles. Nothing nice about it. And the worst part about doing this in Hawaii was we kept getting this, it's Hawaii. Oh, man.
They have very good PR.
It's Hawaii. Well, replication is key, and I talked about really raising our standards when it comes to establishing an evidence base. We have to hold ourselves to higher standards in this field. And replication is a really big part of it. So it started to move. Our next move after Hawaii was a study in Seattle, Washington. I almost regret the study. A randomized control trial. It was intended to be a test of concept. We were applying this to really high-risk parolees coming out of Washington's prison. We took the worst of the worst. 1/4 of my subjects had killed somebody under the influence of an illicit drug. We're talking about the big guys in the system. We had some really tough stuff. I tell you, I've had some really hard time sitting through observations of these subjects. This is the toughest crowd I did. You know how when the hair stands up on your back? These are my subjects. This is the toughest group I'd ever dealt with. And what we found is almost exactly the same results. Even with this population, drug use fell substantially, their arrest was down, you managed to get their violation down, they were much less likely to return to prison. But what we did have here was an exceptional team administering the program. We'll talk about program fidelity in a bit. Keeping the credibility of that threat. Everyone has to do this super duper well. In Seattle, if you had an appointment at 1 o'clock, often if you didn't come in, you'd be in house by 1:15. If your appointment was 1 o'clock, you weren't there by 1:05. Every cop in Seattle, across all enforcement agencies, had your face on their screen. Everybody was looking for you. The turnaround time, which would normally have taken weeks for a bench warrant to have been issued or a warrant to be issued, months later you may or may not see the person. This was happening in minutes. We had reconfigured the system to move so quickly that everybody suddenly managed to find a watch and come to their appointments on time. It was amazing. But this is where I talk about researcher regret. Sometimes you have to be careful what you do as researchers. So many states right now are desperate for solutions. And it was a tiny trial. It wasn't meant to be an outcomes evaluation. We just wanted to see if we could get the system to maneuver in a parole system rather than a probation department. It was a proof of concept. We were then going to do the trial. We had 35 subjects in each condition.
Oh.
That's terrible. It wasn't meant to be a trial. It was proof of concept. Later on, it was a pilot trial. They took it to the legislature, and within months, they made it go. It didn't become law in months, it became law immediately, and they rolled it out statewide within a few months.
Which state again?
Washington. Washington went crazy. They took this idea, they were so desperate for solutions, they just rolled it out en masse. Now, they got really lucky, because what should have happened, and I kept saying to them, this is the state that kills hope. To the Secretary of Corrections, who's a good friend. You're the man who's going to destroy what could be a potentially interesting program. And it should have. They got super lucky. Because violating was higher on the front end, and violating is coming down now. They were so lucky that their friends in law enforcement were helping them and went out after those guys who were violating. Because they could have had a real mess on their hands. Now the bad news for me is they did a really bad thing, and they got away with it, so I don't get to say I told you so, and I really don't want other jurisdictions to do the same thing, because New York's about to do this. Oh my gosh.
They want to gigantize the whole thing?
Oh my gosh. If they do, they better be very careful. The lesson in this is that it's actually really hard to do this well, and you've got to start small. We have two wonderful sites with the same project, same program applied to juveniles. If you talk about a good parenting model, the idea here, and of course we're not throwing people in jail if they're kids, the idea is to have a swift and certain response to violating for kids. Again, trying to rein in jurisdictions from escalating too quickly. Yes.
What can you give us just a specific example of the tiny non-jail?
Yeah, some places we're dealing with the most high risk, and a lot of our kids have a history of violence. If there is an imminent public safety risk, they will be removed and spend a few nights in custody. And that's when there's a victim in the home and they think something bad is about to happen. But typically what it would be is a reflective, you stay in the probation department, it's a reflective essay for a couple of hours, some community time, but it happens right now. They hate the essay writing task. And then you have to write a reflective essay about why my drug use is really has really hurt my family and me and my teachers, and why this was not, and what an inconvenience it is to everybody, including my parents, who had to drive me to court today. When they have to think about how their behavior influences other people, that's a very uncomfortable thought experiment. So the reflective essays are very unpopular. Even just sitting in court and watching other kids be processed, which is good because it helps them realize everybody else is being handled exactly the same way. This isn't a function of you, this is a function of the system. So there are those smaller, sometimes just help keeping people in detention, but not overnighting. They're just being held for 5 hours, with nothing fun to read, maybe an encyclopedia. And they're the same kind of thing. In fact, I'm going to share with you in a bit what I think is a really delicious result, and I wish the Department of Justice would hurry up and test this. What we're finding is that if you can do something swiftly and certainly, you can really compensate for severity. So that we now are thinking that for many of our subjects, we do not need a night in jail. We can have those other sanctions kicking in. Because we've got, again, RAND is a great source now with their new study that shows the dose doesn't matter. So we could really be taking this entirely in a non-incarcerating framework soon. That would be very exciting. So there are now 40 jurisdictions in 20 states that have a similar model. The Department of Justice has funded what's called the National Demonstration Field Experiment. Is this being recorded? Do we know?
There's a video camera running.
Because I may not say negative things about a project if I'm being recorded. After this, come and talk with me about this project. Because this is really an example of what good intentions, and it is a fantastic project, just in case you're recorded. But it has cats in the potter. This is a freaking disaster. Right? This is just exactly how we should not do things. They took a model that was born in Hawaii for Hawaiian circumstances. They're now spending $10 million replicating the Hawaiian version of this in 4 states. There was no attempt made to try to make it appropriate for the local jurisdiction, to make any adjustment whatsoever. I'll share with you in a little bit what we're doing in Washington, why we think we have a much better strategy for handling something like this. Get it right first, then launch the trial. Spending the $10 million first, and then that tells you, hey, we needed to do some adjustments. Why is that helpful? So there's a $10 million study right there. Right, this is from the Demonstration Field Experiment. 4 states, 200 subjects in each condition in each of the 4 states. Similar results. This is distribution of warrants. How many of them had to have warrants issued? This curve. I can show you every behavior. You see the same kind of thing. And we keep figuring out very quickly who we should devote our attention to. And the resource allocation model kicks in very quickly. These are the people we focus on. We don't miss these guys over here. They just don't need nearly as much of our attention. Yes?
Just a quick editorial comment, if it's okay, Suzanne.
Sure.
We have been addicted for decades to the normal distribution in science, right? Where we lump everybody in the middle. And it's only in recent years where academia and the practice has realized that most things in the world are skewed distributions, and we need to handle the upper tail and not worry so much about the lower tail. And it's very hard to change the minds of academia, policy people, and government. So I cheer you on, and Mark and others. And I'm in a small, non-existent program that Suzanne used to be in, where we try to teach people that what matters is this distribution.
And it is. And I can tell you, we're a small group of researchers showing this, because everybody's reporting the means. Everyone's reporting this is 3 arrests, 3 this, 3 that. No, that doesn't show you what's interesting. You have to look at the full distribution of data to know how to solve this problem.
Not the bill.
And they don't. And none of it looks bell-shaped. I wish you'd go back to that department and keep screaming with us, because they have to get away from
Well, our
that.
department is dead.
I'm sorry to
And
hear
that's
that.
being recorded.
Go ahead.
Going back to that other one, have you looked at the differences between what the people who are 4 and 5 plus look like
Yeah,
versus
I was at
0 and
DOJ
1?
last week and Monday, and we were talking about what we're going to be doing next, and that is, it's like really to start figuring out what are the characteristics of the folks that are up here. I can tell you what we did find, though, which is again why people are interested. So far, we have found no differences in terms of race ethnicity. Wow. Okay.
Good.
We are finding some differences by drug, but not much. It turns out that if you're a heroin user, you're more likely to make it to the side of the tail, but it just takes one more drug test. In other words, we shouldn't give up on you because you're a heroin user. There's still lots of room to be optimistic if you're a heroin user, but it's going to take a little bit more to get your attention. So we asked, so I think in terms of the differences, probably the most important difference has been type of drug, with heroin being the clear outlier. But it's not that, the lag isn't that big even. We still seem to have, it's maybe 1 or 2 more goes at it before the judge gets your attention. This is the violation rate over time. We talked about how important it is. Ignore this. This is the month of launch. There was also not much. This is tiny samples underlying. This is really where we kicked in. And you'll notice that this violation rate has been coming down over time. This is the 4-state demonstration field experiment. The solid line is Washington State. They had this crazy rollout period. Everybody was really, they did 17,000 offenders in this in 2 months.
Ooh.
And other states have the max, the most they've ever done is 200 at a time. 17,000, that's a lot of action. And you can see, you're seeing various, now these are probationists, these are parolees, so they're a tougher crowd, but you're seeing very similar desistance patterns. What's really interesting here is, and it has really important implications for rollout, is the program reputation effect. We had 1 state in the 4-state demonstration field experiment that couldn't pull this off. And the reason was there was such malaise among the practitioners. They didn't like each other.
Which state?
I'm not allowed to say it. 1 state that really couldn't pull it together. the prosecutor's office and the probation office and the courts just didn't get along. All of their results are anomalous, and we usually note them with a star. What you're looking at here is basically a cohort analysis. This is people who entered HOPE during the first 3 months of the program coming into existence. And this is, so the blue bars are their violation rate. The red bars are people who are tracked for exactly the same amount of time, but so these are new, in both cases these are fresh recruits, but they entered when the program was in its 6th month. Notice the reputation effect. The word hits the streets. It's like, hey, they actually mean it. They said they're going to give you these rules and you have to play by them, and actually this time, for the first time ever in history, we have a system that's actually delivering credible threats, and they plan to follow through. So the word of mouth really does this a lot. So ignore the state, which really never got it right. So we do constant fidelity monitoring, and that's been a problem from the beginning. But you can see this massive. This is an East Coast state. Massive reputation effects that kicked in really quickly. And that is indications for why you should go small rather than big. Fidelity, the system is this type of approach is really easy to describe. It's hellishly difficult to do it well. So many people have to collaborate and cooperate and actually kind of trust each other. And that's where the state that went wrong didn't quite have it in place. To do the right thing and to move things along really, really quickly and make sure there's an appropriate response every time there's a violation. I call this the Cartier curve, which is in honor of David Farabee's project director, who did not work with me. I was not able to get UCLA. I tried to get him. UCLA wouldn't give me him without destroying his retirement. He wanted to come and play, and you didn't give him to me. But I still like to honor him, even though he wasn't involved in the project, because this is something he warned us on the front end. That if you have a project, fidelity, in other words, operationalizing that, gets better and better when people are learning, right? They're getting better at doing it. And then at some point, it goes the opposite. And this is what, at some point it's just not shiny and new anymore. We start to resume our bad behaviors of the past, and drift can kick in. So, and then we have data that shows if the program drifts, the outcomes drift along with that drift. So this is the Cartier curve. This is the idea is that we improve over time, but at some point we might plateau, and there's somebody's looking over our shoulders to make sure we still do this correctly. Otherwise, this unfortunate side of the Cartier curve kicks in. What we do now, we encourage researchers to do in general, is really watch what they're studying. It's hard to know how to interpret your trial results if the program looks nothing as described. So we have something we now refer to as the Fidelity of Implementation Tracker. Every month, we collect fidelity data on our sites and report it back to them. This is how you're doing. Yes, you're actually doing this model as described, or no, you've slipped and you better get your act together really, really quickly, or I'm going to have a conversation with your boss. We're not that mean, but we imply it. And with this sort of fidelity monitoring, you can avoid this drift, right? You can keep things at a really high level of fidelity to make sure that you have the outcomes that you hope to achieve. Yes?
Yes, you get the groupthink syndrome too. So you need somebody in a group who's always a little bit of the devil's advocate, as well as fidelity to the principles.
Yeah.
And there's all those group dynamics.
Oh yeah. And in some groups it works, and we had one where it just really broke down. And that runs out. We have a number of, I think, really important unknowns. So we had this trial initially in Hawaii that we've now, it's blown across the country, I think, in some ways too quickly, because we're not doing enough thinking and learning, we're just expanding without taking time to think and learn first. A very important question is, what is the optimal sanction?
Oh.
There is an optimal sanction, right? It might be different for different classes. We don't know if the 2-day sanction or 3-day sanction or 1-week sanction is it. Could we do, is 3 days different from 1 day? Could 5 hours do it? And we have some evidence from RAND that suggests they ran out of jail space in one of their 24/7 sites and couldn't put people overnight. It used to be an overnight. So they gave them a 5-hour hold. And then they ran out of space for the 5-hour holds and started doing 1-hour holds. Guess what? Made no difference. 1 night in jail, 5 hours in detention, 1 hour in detention. It made no difference because that inconvenience happened to you right now. It was disruptive.
Electric dog collars, same way.
Yeah.
So our goal now, I think, really, in terms of both the economic value of this as well as just the human I mean, there's a huge human cost of punishment too, is to find the smallest dose of punishment that brings about the desired behavior change. Of course, if someone's doing something heinous and picking up a new crime, they're going back before a judge and they're being sentenced on that. We're talking about the violations that get people back into prison without picking up a new charge, which is a stunning share of our prison population. So really the new work from Rand gives us heart that the swift certain really can compensate for the severity in really important ways. So we're now very interested in studying the non-incarcerating options, and the test now is how low can we go before we lose their attention. This is a principle that I've discussed today as applied to probation and parole, but my guess is that this would apply relatively well with any high-risk group where there's a monitoring issue, scarce capacity, lots of violating. Put a high-risk group on notice, watch them, and then concentrate your enforcement on them and bring the violation under control. If I have any time, and I have no idea if I do, I want to talk about what we're doing in Washington and why it's so very unpopular. Huh?
Unpopular with whom?
Oh, with everybody. Actually, no. It's unpopular because it's something new. New is hard, right? Especially hard for funding agencies, and if you're a researcher, you depend on them. The current system we have for research is really quite broken. This is what we do. We have an idea that comes up, and then we study it in a very expensive way, and then we lock it in, because by the time the results come out, someone's made a manual. And the manual's there, and you can't pull back once there's a manual. Even though the research results now say something terrible, it's really hard to defund something or get people unexcited about something that has a logo, especially if there's an acronym. You get the idea, right? So we tend to spend a lot of money on research, these kinds of trials, and that's why we do so few. In criminal justice, we do about 4 trials a year. Maybe now up to 5 or 6, maybe it's a little bit more, but it's tiny numbers. And the last time we did the analysis was 4 a year. Because we make them such a big deal to do, so expensive. Well, it turns out, kind of ironically, that the easiest thing to study, if you get the research method right, you don't have to have very sophisticated tools, right, to know if it's working. Is a trial is actually pretty easy to do if you have the relationships with the people who have to do it, and you have access to administrative data. So this shouldn't be a very big deal. So we have that, for example, when I told you the $10 million study from DOJ, which will have results, if we're lucky, by 2017. They never tested it right to get it right in the first place, so that they're going to be reporting results in a model that no one's using anymore. So it's changed so much already anyway. Who cares what the results say in 2017? We have to have a new way of doing this. And this is where this idea came to me. And we were working with Washington State because they had done this crazy thing of 17,000 people in the model, and we were trying to really help them contain the crisis that was potentially imminent. And they did. They succeeded. Their leadership from the top was fantastic. They had a fantastic implementation team. They got lucky. But I went to a meeting with an entrepreneur. He owns many hotels. And I said to him, I'm so frustrated by my field. The consequences are so high in my field, and we do so few trials, we accumulate knowledge so slowly, and the quality of our evidence base is disgustingly bad. And I'm frustrated. He said to me, Angela, right now, we're running a bunch of randomized control trials in the basement of this hotel. We're figuring out if the light switch should be here or here. I was furious. Subway sandwiches runs thousands of trials a month. Walmart's running thousands of trials a month. Who cares? The stakes are so different. We have lives at stake, and we do 4 a year. We should be embarrassed. We should be embarrassed. Let's make it easier to accumulate good quality knowledge. And this is where my team became innovative. We said, okay, forget everything else. Let's forget the funders. Let's just volunteer our time. Let's figure out a way to do this better. Because it's pretty unusual, I guess, for academics to volunteer the time. No time. We had a little tiny implementation funding thing. We had some travel money so we could get there. And we got inside that state agency. And we started looking around for problems and solutions. And encouraging them to test something really quickly. And if it looks promising, keep going. If it doesn't, stop it. And you know what? If you tell us something doesn't work, we're going to give you as much credit and put the face on your wall as if you tell us something does work. Getting to know is as important as getting to yes. And this is a stunning revolution in our field. The idea that researchers can work alongside practitioners to together look for solutions to our problems, rather than these outside ivory tower creatures who are testing models that are not relevant for practitioners to begin with often. And our delayed processes makes it years before we can even get started, so that what we do, by that time, the agencies have changed, the heads have changed, and things aren't really relevant anyway. I think what we're doing in Washington State will create more solutions for criminal justice than the combined efforts that are going on at DOJ right now. I don't think I'm being arrogant. I really think it's true. We are learning so much so quickly. We have access to all their data. We can try, we can stop, we can try, we can stop in 1 month timelines rather than 6-year timelines. Very tough to turn research around on its head. Funding agencies, when I go and give a presentation, they love the idea and they'll tell you, there's no mechanism for this. We don't have funding for work like this because this is not traditional research. Even the foundations are struggling to fund it because this is, well, is it implementation work? Is it traditional research? Where's the it's such a confusing idea. Why is this a confusing idea? Engineering departments don't think this is a confusing idea.
Right.
Why in social science when the stakes are so high? Can we not do anything reasonable? So I kind of brought you full circle, I think. I started after lunch saying, oh man, what we're doing is a mess. This is terrible, and I really destroyed your appetite. And then I gave you some hope. We have some really fun things happening across the country now that have the potential to dramatically reduce incarceration. And then I'm ending with a little dose of negativity. Our funding agencies really need to catch up. If we want big solutions to our massive problems, we have to think strategically, both in terms of our interventions as well as rethinking our approach to research. We have to get quicker at acquiring knowledge. And I think that's more than enough. Thank you for your time.
So let me just ask you to think about this in a slightly different way and suggest that the enormous investment, let me take Washington, really came in the form of creating a functional justice system. That is, it hadn't had a system where the relationships among the various people were good, where they were prepared to do this. You couldn't have come in and done that.
Well, that was true in Seattle. This went from one office to 113 field offices really overnight. Less of that. Those relationships weren't in place in all those other offices. I mean, that's where we're still trying to catch up and put those relationships in place. There's lots of little tiny, and the tiny details here really matter. So they're still trying to troubleshoot that. I think Washington State is highly functioning in a place. I think if New York tried to do this way, it would have been a failure. They're going to have to be smarter on the front end to get this right. If any state was going to do something this crazy, it probably would have worked most likely in Washington. That said, they still have a lot of ironing to do to get rid of the wrinkles. But so far they got lucky.
It seems to me that your finding about swift and certain sanction is really important, has far wider implications. In several years of working in the correctional system myself, the perpetual complaint was that the goddamn police lied at the trial.
Right.
I shouldn't be here because it was all perjury. And then you get to know the client a little bit better, and it turns out that he's very proud of the fact that he got away with knocking over about a dozen 7-Elevens before everybody was caught. And so, in fact, it may have been that the police knew all about the previous 12 and couldn't catch him, so last time they set him up. But unfortunately, it's too late.
Well, we get them on the back end, right? They've already been detected. We come to them now. And what I like about this model is that there's something certain. There's a drug test result in front of the person. They have to sign right then acknowledgement of guilt, and they go straight before the judge. No one's arguing about not. If they deny the drug use, it goes out to a lab for confirmation. And if it comes back and the lab confirms, well, you're going to spend much more than a night in jail. Now you've lied to everybody. Which starts to breed behavior of telling the truth. But we have them already. So they've already been. Some judge has sentenced them to some time, usually, and some time on probation. But then you have something very easy to detect. They're either showing up or they aren't. They're testing positive or they aren't. The clear rules are rules that can be monitored. And that's really, really important. That you have to reduce your rules to a set of rules you can actually enforce. I'll go here and then to you.
I thought I heard you say that in one experiment, 25% of your subjects were murderers, and they were either violating or not violating. Does this mean they were free?
Yeah.
And if so, how many murderers are there who are?
Oh, many. Most of your, many murderers. It depends on what the murder case was. But many people with manslaughter will come out and a certain number of many. The murder rate isn't that high. Of the murders who do get committed to custody, it's a sizable one returned into the community.
How big is sizable?
Well, and sometimes not even after a very long. It's not that uncommon to have done 6 years. So, But it depends on the nature of the case. I mean, a manslaughter case could have very few, and something that's quite more willful would have longer term.
Very few murderers are recidivists.
I know a case of a guy who murdered his girlfriend or wife or whatever, and he had said previously, I don't care. I'll serve 5 or 7 years. I'll kill her if she does whatever. And he did.
The recidivism rate usually is relatively low for murderers too. But ours were drug involved, where we were interested in the drug use behavior, and they were coming back, and we would, to screen them into our study again, they had to have been released from prison and have picked, they were back into the habit. Sorry, I'll go to you first and then to you. Sorry.
So would you need to do these programs on a large scale? Would you need like a lot more money put into the criminal justice system, or would you be saving money in other places and reallocating money?
So really it's a reallocation. So what Washington State did is they took the savings, the projected savings from prison, they reallocated it to the community, including some more programming, which they haven't actually gotten to spending yet, but they eventually will. So the idea is that they say, okay, well, if we can expect this kind of reduction into the jail or prison, we can re-spend that. And in some cases it is. You know, in Hawaii, the additional dollars they got, they spent almost exclusively on drug treatment. So if you got to 3 or more drug positives, they wanted to make sure you got really good quality care. But a lot of it is everybody just doing their job, but doing their job more quickly or more smartly. And what we do with jurisdictions now is there's a lot of make work in this line of work. Lots of paper, lots of writing out of long things, which we fill in the blank boxes that work just well. So then often we just behave like management consultants. Like, really, do you have to spend 15 minutes on this? Can you do this and spend 30 seconds instead? And now, well,
thought we had computers.
And oh, you'd be surprised. They do the same thing on computers, like the long sentences, essays on the computer rather than check, 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 check. But a lot of this is really formulaic. So the idea is that yes, it's going to be. There'll be savings on some part that will be reallocated to others, but on net we found that it's definitely given you reduction in criminal behavior and reduction in prison. Prison's expensive. Yeah. So if you save some prison days, you can afford to spend some more community corrections. And that's really what we're asking for. It's like community corrections is such a big push into prison. Can we get this right and avoid that flow through into prison in the first place? Sorry, let me go to that gentleman and then I'll continue.
3 things. 1 comment. First, thank you very much for educating us and giving us hope with your research. 2 questions. 1, how much effort is being expended on treatment and prevention of drug use? 2nd question, how much eventually community involvement is going to be involved where former drug users, judges, police, church, youth groups, etc. are working together over a long term to eradicate this problem?
Well, on the treatment, on the prevention side, I can say relatively little, both at the federal level and this sort of program. We don't get involved until they become somebody who's up on the radar. But in general, I think one of the reasons is we don't really know how to do prevention very well yet, and we're still learning. And I'm hoping as part of the system of lots of trials, figuring things out, we can get better at knowing what works and what do. I think we don't have very good answers to that. We have some programs we can play with around the edges. They tend to be pretty expensive and not enough bang for your buck. They're also not very well targeted often. In terms of community involvement, what we have seen in Hawken, Hawaii, and this might, I'm not yet sure for the mainland experience, is that we're starting to see some really good employment is a real challenge for this population. We're starting to see employers actually come to the judge and say, can I have some of your guys because I know they're clean. So we are starting to see some relationships now where, and actually there's been enough kind of poster cases where people have really turned their lives around in a big way and and it's probably been in place for 10 years, where you've even seen, we even have dentists now coming in who are saying, okay, well, a woman has no front teeth. It's really tough to get through a job interview with no front teeth. She's done so well for so long, as our prize to her from the court in graduation, we're going to give her veneers. So that sort of thing has been happening, which is kind of sweet. And that's completely without anybody, any impetus except community players saying, wow. And what's also very surprising is there's lots of doctors and lawyers with a brother or a cousin or somebody who at some stage is coming before the judge. And they tend to be very giving and giving back. So we are starting to see more community involvement, not as much as it might be, and it'll be interesting to see if that replicates. Maybe Hawaiians are nicer on the mainland. So let me go to that gentleman at the TV. Okay.
So you said this distribution, which you might call the 80-20 rule, except that it seems to be more like a 95-5% rule, right? Is constant across many different applications. Now, what's special about the 5%? So if you leave aside the drug observation, is there anything else that we can say about them? You already said race and ethnicity doesn't matter. But is there any way that one could identify those?
That was the question from Betsy, and that's actually one of our next steps in this, is to start to get, because we can't really predict that group based on race and ethnicity. We can't really, so a lot of the measures we have right now, we're not doing very well. We don't have a lot of enough finesse in our measures. We have an application in, we have a really hard time with this one in NIH, primarily because I think the NIH is looking for treatment responses, and this really is a different kind of model, right? What we really would like to do is start doing imaging on the failures. Like, what is different? And starting to take a battery of tests. Is there something fundamental that we can help to understand who this is working for and who it is? Because the obvious ones we don't have anything on. And we still have more digging to do with the data we have, but I'm convinced we're going to have to go outside of our data to get to some of these root relationships, because our data is just not rich enough. So we really need, but then you need the big funding. And we've tried, and NIH, I think, is going to come around because there's enough of it going on in the country, and at some point they're going to be embarrassed not to be involved in the program that has more drug resistance in it than anything else they're looking at. So eventually they'll come to the table, but not yet. And it's not because they're evil, it's just it has to go through reviewers, and I think the reviewers are uncomfortable with the model still. Unless you understand, I think unless you understand it and unless you go to a court, just hearing it described, it sounds punitive until you've been there and you realize this is really a therapeutic environment in this courtroom right now. There's the detectable offense, it's being responded to right now, the offender's owning up to it, and he's back on the street tomorrow. But they haven't quite gotten there yet. So there's no villain, it just takes a while for the field to catch up. Yes, ma'am.
I have two concerns that I want to say out loud so other people can hear them as well. I can talk loud. Okay. One is that the assumption is that there's only one kind of addiction, which is not accurate from what I know. There are various modes and models. Some people can stop for a long time and start whenever they want, or they decide. Others do it off and on. There's all variations. There's not just a consistent always or never. And the second part of the story that you're telling us is that the drug use seems to have a direct result as a cause to criminal behavior. Let me finish before you answer me. And that is incorrect. Because the assumption is that the inmate will always say, it wasn't me, it was the drug. It wasn't me, it was my friends. It wasn't me, it was something else. And the drug is used, but it is not the cause.
All right, I've never said drugs cause crime. I did say they were drug involved. No, they were drug involved offenders.
But that's what you're talking about.
No, so what we do see is that when we see reductions in drug, there is reductions in drug use, and when subjected to this model, whether it's other parts of the model or the drug use, we do see reductions in criminal activity. So we're reporting reductions in criminal activity, reductions in drug use. The causal mechanisms are extremely complicated, and I wouldn't ever dare to go there. I've written about this in the past, how we have very little to go on in terms of the direct relationship between drug use and crime. In terms of the various types of addiction and drug dependency, I couldn't agree with you more, and that's part of the point, is that we treat everybody as though they are one kind of drug-involved offender, and we shouldn't be. We need to triage them out. Let's find people that have really serious problems that need to be dealt with now. They can't be dealt with a tiny dose of treatment. They need Cadillac-level care, need much more care than we're willing to give. I really like your question, and this is what we like too in the trenches doing right now. Well, what about the long term here? Do we have people desist for 2 years when they're on community supervision and return to drug use as soon as no one's watching them? And that's a study we have ongoing now. We have a long-term outcome study now using hair. Have they returned to drug use when no one's watching? So that's a question that's really quite researchable, and we'll come back to you with an answer on that. I think it's a really important question, though, because if you think about how California responses, we treat everybody who's arrested as though they're kind of similar, except to the point where they tell us about themselves. And that is tough. I've got so much data that shows the disconnect between what people report themselves as using and what I can get from their urine or their hair. Massive differences in self-reported behavior and actual drug use. So we have to realize there's more nuance. I think we actually agree more than disagree on many of these issues. And that's really the point. We have to start triaging people into the different groups. Different strategies will work for different types of drug-involved offenders. Yes, sir.
Two of the main staples of the program seem to be having a clearly identifiable and measurable parole probation violation via a drug test. and then using that to swiftly respond to it. Is there some intervention or program or measure done in which there's a different measure than drug use?
Okay, we have a couple. I just focus on drug involved offenders because we have a nice graphic in there, 1 hour. We have the same thing is done with, for example, felony domestic violence offenders. It turns out that about 87% of people who are referred to battery intervention programs never go or never finish, and there's really not much consequence. So if you're a domestic violence, if you're a felony domestic violence offender and you don't show up for your batteries intervention program, there's going to be an action taken by the court, which is really quite unusual. So there's kind of the showing up and doing what you're supposed to do, whether it's an anger management class or a batteries intervention program, is showing up to your appointment. In some cases, there's also there's restitution payments that might be made if the person is employed, or even the positive steps that you're supposed to be taking. If you're deemed to be eligible for employment, then you have to demonstrate that you've made some attempt to seek employment. Employment's really protective. We want to get as many of this population into employment as possible, and even that can be sanctioned by the court. It's unusual for them to give a jail sanction, but there'll be some sanction given. So there's quite a few things that they can. But anything you can observe, you can bring into the model.
Why don't you take one more question? It's going up on 2:30.
Oh, okay.
But we can't exhaust you forever, although we would like to.
I think we're done. That's perfect timing. Well, thank you, everybody. It was fun to see you.
We met the last time.
Yes, I know.
John Reagan and John.
Nice to see you again. It's corruption last time.
I'm just saying for email, so I like the person. I did have one more.
In Europe. Oh, yes.
Actually, it's having I think I suffer from the American research syndrome, is that we do not enough of that. They are there's some really fascinating work going on. Like the one, and they're getting almost zero cost intervention.
It's trying to be somebody and sort of so there's a lot of that going on.
I always said, Obama was
She spoke too fast.
You can't say it.
But the speed, I lost it. I do that too. But sometimes I can imagine
Get rid of it.
they talk too fast and then they come in there on the solo. It makes it more difficult.
Oh yes, I think that's true, but I think.
And it's not a hearing problem.
I think all the cookies are gone.
No, don't assume that. Don't assume that. That's what everybody will tell you.